Good morning. I'm happy that all of you could join us today for this briefing on Germany and the rule of law ahead of the elections that are taking place on Sunday. As many of you know, we at Democracy Reporting International have been doing these types of events and briefings ahead of European elections over the past 2 years. And with the opportunity to discuss about the situation in our own backyard as an NGO based in Berlin, we couldn't pass up the chance to share with you some of our findings and observations about the rule of law and Germany. I'm happy to be joined today by Dr. Tu Nguyen from the Jacques Delors Center here in Berlin, and by Michael Meyer-Rezende, our Executive Director at DRI, who will be talking a bit about the situation in Germany, how it interacts with the European situation, and what we can potentially expect out of next week's out of Sunday's elections. This conversation takes place as part of our reconstitution program, which is funded by Stiftung Mercator. So I'd like to start us a bit with the basics. I was wondering, Michael, if you could tell us a bit about what are the main rule of law issues in Germany to start with. It's not a country usually associated with major rule of law problems, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. So if you could set the stage for us a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Hans. I think the first remark to make is that there are rule of law issues in Germany, although it does quite well on various international charts. But there are issues, and these issues, except for one, haven't played a big role in this election campaign. So that is maybe the first remark to make, that rule of law was not an issue of this campaign. But the issues that have been highlighted repeatedly by various European bodies, including by the European Commission, have to do, of course, the bigger case around the decision by the German Constitutional Court, saying that the European Court of Justice was adopting a decision that was outside its mandate on the European Central Bank, and I think we discuss that a bit later. This is one of the bigger issues that we had in the last years. But then there are a number of other issues that come up regularly in reporting. I would highlight, for example, that for a long time, international bodies think Germany could do more to combat corruption. There have been improvements, there have been legal changes. But still, in many fields, it's not particularly effective. And there's one I would highlight here, because we monitor in DRI a lot social media, and we look at regulation of social media. And one thing that's really difficult here is that the reporting on campaign and party financing is done publicly much, much later. So often these reports take more than 1 year to be published by the parties. So if we now want to know what are parties investing, for example, in Facebook ads, we don't get any data from them. We have those data only in 1 or 1.5 years. And I think for our world, where a lot of this campaigning is online, that's not good enough, for example. So this is one, I think, where European bodies have generally not been too happy. And then there's another one, and I know you want to discuss that in more detail, which was related to independence of the prosecutors. But I think the overall message is there are rule of law issues here. The government adopted a rule of law pact, thinking that courts are too slow and there are too few positions. So it's not a poster boy of the perfect rule of law or something. We have quite many challenges here.
Thank you, Michael. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit, why don't you think it's seen as a major issue by German voters, the rule of law? Because it's not a perfect poster boy, but it seems to be completely off the radar for electors.
Yeah, I would say many of these things are seen as highly technical and legal, and you know, it's too complicated, and there's no strong sense of suffering. You know, if we compare now to Poland, for example, where, you know, judges are stripped of their positions, or where they face penalties because they have made a decision, because they cooperate with the European Court, that's painful. And, you know, many people can understand that. And in Germany, I don't think there's this level of pain on anybody's side. So it's not seen as a big issue.
Thank you. As you mentioned, In the past few weeks, there was a raid on the finance ministry that's brought the German prosecutorial system under criticism. Just earlier this week, the lead candidate for the Social Democrats was brought in front of a parliamentary committee to answer questions on exactly this. I was wondering if you could explain to us a bit what happened and why this is a rule of law issue.
Yeah, that was a really curious incident. And if you scratch the surface a bit, it goes quite deep into a lot of EU issues also. So some weeks ago, there was a search in the finance ministry by prosecutorial service of the Land of Lower Saxony. So we are a federal state, and the prosecution is managed by the 16 states, almost all of the prosecution services in Germany. And so these people come from Lower Saxony, they take the train to Berlin, and they walk into the finance ministry and say, we will do a search here because we think you or one of the agencies that are under your legal supervision has not been effective in fighting money laundering. And we are researching or investigating whether we should launch a case there. Now, that a few weeks before the election campaign, when the finance minister is the lead candidate of the Social Democratic Party, is a totally political situation, of course. And very quickly, there are allegations that this was politically motivated because the Minister of Justice of Lower Saxony is from the CDU, the competing party. So the allegation goes that she called these prosecutors and said, why don't you drive to Berlin and have a search? And maybe at this point, it's good because it's briefly before the campaign. She vigorously denies these allegations. And that's more or less where it ended. And yeah, now there was an investigative committee in Parliament, but that was not new. This was an ongoing effort. But what nobody talked about was the whole issue behind. The EU already for several years said that it has a real problem with the fact that German prosecutors can be instructed in individual cases. And for this reason, the European Court of Justice said that European arrest warrants cannot be executed in Germany because these prosecutors are not sufficiently independent. Germany then fixed that problem and said, okay, from now on, every arrest warrant will be approved by a judge. So there is no practical problem at the moment with arrest warrants, but the underlying issue that judges can be instructed in individual cases remains. And there's a law that may change it, but it has not yet been adopted. But I think this case showed that it's problematic, even if it's only for perception issues. It would be much easier if one could say no prosecutor can be instructed in an individual case. So in the future, there cannot be even this kind of suspicion that something like that happened. But this lower level, this question of architecture of the rule of law and the European dimension was absolutely not discussed in Germany. It was just about this bet between these two ministers.
Great, thanks for that context. Moving to kind of more of the interaction between Germany and the EU, there have been tensions between the EU and Germany regarding a recent decision by the Federal Constitutional Court on the role of the European Central Bank. Even an infringement procedure was launched by the Commission towards Germany on this question. So too, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what's behind this and how does it affect the rule of law on the European level?
Yes, well, thank you first of all for having me here this morning. I think this is a very interesting topic, and I think it's nice that we're also looking really into rule of law issues in Germany and not just sort of in specific countries. Yes, I think we all know the decision, the PSPP decision or the Vice decision was from last year in May, in which the German Constitutional Court said that they didn't think the European Court of Justice did a very good job in assessing the ECB's program, and therefore they didn't feel like they were bound by this particular judgment, which of course evoked a lot of criticism and a lot of, well, I don't know what's the word for negative excitement, but a lot of Aufregung in Germany, in German. And indeed, the Commission then started an infringement proceeding against Germany for the fact that, well, a German court denied or refused to follow an ECJ judgment. To put it perhaps a bit in context for the European legal order, this is of course somewhat of a problem if national courts stop following the ECJ's judgments. So the EU legal order is very much based on the notion of EU law supremacy, because of course, if EU law doesn't take effect in the member states or doesn't take effect in national courts, what is the use of it really? So the EU law sort of depends on national courts to apply it, and also for national courts to stick to it and to follow Luxembourg judgments. And then in this particular case, it's of course also somewhat of a problem because it's the German court. So it's not entirely surprising, because the Bundesverfassungsgericht has always been somewhat skeptical, or at least has always put boundaries to its own acceptance of EU law supremacy, but it has never actually gone as far as to say we will not follow an ECJ judgment. And because, of course, the Bundesverfassungsgericht is a very powerful one, and perhaps also one that is being looked at very much outside of Germany as well, the fear and the worry was that it might have a spill effect onto other courts, in particular captured courts in other countries. So I sort of forgot the question, sorry.
Well, you're going in the right direction. Actually, what I would ask you to kind of follow up, because not being a lawyer myself, looking at how the German court is challenging, to a certain extent, Brussels, I'm wondering, how does this differentiate from the challenges that we see coming from Poland, for example, where there is a slew of cases with the Constitutional Tribunal right now as well?
Well, it's more a challenge from Karlsruhe to Luxembourg more so than to Brussels, I think. So this is more of a issue between the courts. I think there's quite a difference between what Karlsruhe does and between what is happening in Poland and Hungary. I know that sometimes it's being equated, especially in Poland and Hungary, but of course, the Bundesverfassungsgericht doesn't challenge the notion of supremacy as such. It doesn't challenge the possibility of primacy of Luxembourg as a principle. It merely said that the ECJ didn't do a good enough job, basically, for it to follow the judgment. But it's not saying that we are challenging or questioning the primacy of law as a principle. And I think that is sort of the major difference, that we don't have a structural questioning of EU law primacy in Germany, neither from the government nor from the courts, really. But it's a very specific instance. And also the case law of Karlsruhe, of the Bundesverfassungsgericht, was always very specific in the boundaries that it set and in the exceptions that it set, in which cases it would not follow ECJ judgment. I think that is the major difference here, that it's really not a structural issue, and especially not a fundamental questioning of this principle of EU law. Of course, it's being instrumentalized, and I think that was always the fear, that in the general public or outside the bubble, that perhaps this difference doesn't really come across that much, because it's a very fine distinction, perhaps also. And of course, it's not always being reported as such in some medias either. So I think the problem here is that fundamentally it's different, and I think for us it's very clearly a difference. But it's very difficult sometimes to explain why this is a different case than perhaps Poland and Hungary, which is why I thought it was very good that the Commission started the infringement procedure, to be honest, simply for the fact that it takes a bit the wind out of the sail for Poland and Hungary, or even other countries, to say, why are you letting it slide in Germany, but then are going after us for doing the same thing. It's not the same thing, but of course, perhaps on the forefront of it, it sometimes can look a bit like it's the same thing.
So if I understand it correctly, in a way, between Karlsruhe and Luxembourg, it's more a question of, let's call it the healthy tension that you would find in a democracy between the different institutions and centers of power, whereas some of the challenges that we see coming from Poland or Hungary are more part of a wider political debate. Yes, Michael, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit... The Constitutional Court here was quite criticized after they made this decision. And I think rightly so, even on legal grounds, because they said that what Luxembourg did was obviously outside its remit. And, you know, that's a super strong statement for manifestly outside its remit. It's a super strong statement to make for a court. And then it goes on dozens of pages why it is so obvious. And as a lawyer, you know already, if somebody has to write dozens of pages, maybe it's not so entirely obvious. So in a way, I think this judgment was quite badly founded legally. And therefore, I didn't find it entirely healthy. I think to raise the fundamental question, you know, these limits is okay. I have understanding for the case law of the Constitutional Court, which we should say was built up over decades. So that's already a huge difference to Poland, I would say. This is a dogmatic that is going on for decades, and it's well-founded, and you can say it's bad or good, but it's not out of the blue because some government wants you to shield you from EU law. And the other thing with this decision was, which makes it totally different to Poland and Hungary, it was directed towards more control of the executive or of you know, something like the European Central Bank. And the whole issue in Poland is the exact opposite. It's that government wants to control courts and doesn't want Europe to interfere. So for the German government, this was not welcome at all, what Karlsruhe did. That's a big difference to what the Polish Constitutional Tribunal is doing, which is generally very welcome for the government. And that's why it took it over some years ago.
Thanks for that. So there's an infringement. Oh, go ahead, please.
Just wanted to make a quick one. I wasn't saying that I thought the German judgment was good. I just wanted to make that a bit clear. I fully share Michael's concerns. Just wanted to say there's a bit of a difference, but I didn't think it was a great judgment either. No.
So now that there's an infringement procedure on their way, what do you see as the way out? What are the next steps?
I think that's a very good question. I think the problem here is that, of course, the infringement proceedings go against the government or directed at the government. But at the core of the conflict is an independent constitutional court, which is why I think a lot of people were also very critical of this infringement proceeding, because they said, well, where is this supposed to go? There's nothing the government can do to influence the court because well, it's an independent constitutional court, and at the core or at the practical side of things, the issue has been solved. So the ECB and the Bundesbank gave some information to the Bundestag and the government, and they said that's fine with them, and then the court said that's fine with it as well. So at the on practical grounds, it's been solved. So for that, the infringement proceedings perhaps wasn't necessary so much anymore. And then now the question is, when it comes to the court, I think it's the government that says, well, where is it supposed to go? What is supposed to be sort of the end game of this? I think it's true. The government cannot tell the Bundesverfassungsgericht what to do, and even if it goes before the ECJ, I'm not sure the Bundesverfassungsgericht will be swayed by the court to say, yes, actually, what you did was correct, and we'll take back our judgment. But I think what perhaps can be done is more on the background. So, I mean, the Commission, of course, has a lot of discretion on how far it wants to take an infringement procedure, whether it would want to take it to the EC in front of the ECJ or not. So perhaps it's also simply a question of the German government reassuring the Commission of its commitment to EU law primacy and EU law authority and ECJ authority. Because as much as I welcome the infringement proceeding as sort of a signal and as a matter of principle, I do share the questions of where is it supposed to go in the end. But I don't know if Michael perhaps wants to also come in on this.
Yeah, I have no special information or outlook on how this will be completed. Yes, it could just be maybe with some recommendations for the future, but of course it's the Commission will not tell the German government that it has to tell the Constitutional Court to do X, Y, Z. That's obviously not an option. But I would say overall, a bit like with the arrest warrant, you see a situation where there's something real going on between Brussels, Luxembourg, Berlin, and somehow then it's solved. But it's solved in ways that, go in the direction of the EU, I would say, with the arrest warrant. Yeah, they changed the practice here, and now the judges are issuing these reports. So they respected the judgment of the European Court of Justice. And the other case on the ECB, that was maybe a bit more pragmatic to avoid that this escalates, but it hasn't resulted in a fundamental damage of the EU law application in Europe. I just saw a comment here by John Marine on not to compare the Polish Constitutional Tribunal with the Karlsruhe Court. And yes, I agree. I mean, I don't think the way that the Polish court was taken over in a way after the election in 2015 was lawful, and therefore I also don't consider it a proper constitutional body. Just to clarify that.
Thank you. I don't think we're going to see much argument with that point on this panel today. I want to move us a bit more towards the European level, but first I want to remind everyone listening that please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll be going over some of our topics, but there will be ample time for questions and answers during this, so please don't hesitate to write them down and send them to us as they come to you. So we're looking at the rule of law as a debate that didn't really feature in the German election. What really struck me as a bit of an outsider, despite the name, I'm actually Canadian, is how the German election feels as if it was taking place on an island. There was very little featuring of Europe until last night's debate, or of how Germany can move on some of the biggest challenges of our times with the rest of Europe. People will be marching in the streets here in Berlin today for Fridays for Future climate marches. These are existential challenges, but if you just look at the campaign, if you just look at the debate, Europe or wider international affairs seem to be almost completely absent. So before we go more onto the rule of law, I'd like to have your thoughts on this more general lack of a European awareness or presence on the campaign trail from a country that's in the heart of the continent. Michael, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, this is a long-standing concern here. I would say I feel it very acutely. You know, I lived in 6 different EU member states, and have lots of connections into many EU member states. So my life is quite European, and it's all quite real for me. And then I see the debates here, and it indeed feels like Germany is an island. That was particularly visible in many of the main TV debates, where public TV didn't put a single question on anything beyond the German borders. And it's painful to see. It has been much criticized. I don't know how the discussion went last night. I didn't have time to see it. Maybe you saw it. There was one special debate on foreign policy, but that was a bit a niche format. And, you know, it was organized by the Munich Security Conference, and I don't think too many people watched it. But you mentioned today Fridays for Future, and I hear, you know, that this is also in my family. If I talk to relatives, they say, yeah, but climate, it's so global. Why do we think we can solve it in Germany? And I mean, apart from Germany being one of the biggest economies, they don't really understand that Germany is a big mover and shaker for the entire EU. So there's a lot of influence that Germany has on these kind of things. But for many people, it's not very tangible. And I think the way that, in this case, the public media worked these debates didn't really help to enlighten that aspect more.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Michael and kind of disagree. I don't know. So yes, I think it's very true that Europe was very much missing in the debate, and which is a bit weird because it feels like everyone looks at Germany, but Germany is not really looking outside. On the other hand, the one time that Europe was mentioned was this time when the CDU said, well, if Scholz becomes chancellor, then the entire EU will break apart, kind of argument, which is very destructive. So if this was to be sort of the level of discourse, then perhaps it may be better to leave it out entirely. To be honest, I think maybe perhaps for some topics, if it's so destructive, then maybe it's almost disfavorable to perhaps the EU and Germany to have in the campaign. In terms of a more or less destructive campaign or a more constructive campaign on Europe, I think it would have been very nice. But on the other hand, I'm not sure the parties differ all that much, to be honest, in their EU program. So I think there's a lot of similarities and perhaps differences that are too complicated to explain to the public. And here I fully agree with you that it might have been, or it should have been, the role of the media to explain it to the public, that there is a difference, and that's very important, that we are, of course, at the heart of Europe, and that the empty chair that Merkel now leaves is one that will be very important for the future of the EU. I think it should have been explained much more, and that was definitely missing. But in terms of campaigning and debates, I do understand a bit that perhaps the differences are more clear when it comes to a minimum wage, or when it comes to climate measures, or I don't know, even digitalization. But even that was a topic where I thought, yes, of course, everyone wants digitalization. It's a bit with Europe. All the parties are pro-European, want more rule of law. If you look at, and I'm sure we'll get to this more specifically, but if you look at the programs on what to do about the rule of law in Europe, they all sound very similar. So I think then for the media or for the campaign to make it clear to the public what is the difference there, it's perhaps not super easy either.
Yeah, though I feel you have to, of course, paint a simple picture to have a proper public debate, and it's not so easy. But on the other hand, after 16 years of Merkel chancellorship, I think there is a big question in the room, but it hasn't really been asked. And the question is we all agree, apart from AfD, that EU is a good thing, and that actually it's a core geostrategic objective of Germany to keep the EU strong and intact and to be part of it, obviously. And in the 16 years, the UK has left. We can discuss if it's anybody's fault or whose fault is it. And in these 16 years, we have especially two member states, Poland and Hungary, that have very much changed their political system. And we all know, especially in the case of Hungary, that Merkel's party, the CDU, was an integral part of that whole story, and has enabled that Hungarian government that has really changed that country. And that becomes an existential challenge to the EU. I mean, now people start talking about Polexit through the legal route, that Poland would leave the EU. It's a big debate in Poland between the politicians, whether that risk is there, and maybe if somebody wants it without saying it. And that shouldn't have happened. We shouldn't have arrived at this point. And I think this could have put on the table in this debate. And I saw some comment here that the Green, for example, have a different take on all this. And I would agree to that. And I think I would have hoped that somebody would juxtapose SPD and especially CDU to the Greens. And, you know, maybe you agree with CDU and you say it's pragmatic. We have too many problems anyway, and we didn't want to have a big fight with Hungary, but put it out, put it there. But very often in German debates, everybody seems superficially to agree. We have all these nice slogans about human rights and democracy, but we don't have hard policy debates, and there are huge differences. And I think it's a failure that they haven't been worked out properly and put on the table for debate in this election campaign, because people are in a cloud about, I think, these challenges, if they're not clearly put there. And we all know, if you have a strong debate, if you have two identifiable positions, and they should have forced the CDU to be much clearer about its position, I think it would have helped voters also to make a clearer choice. Like this, they all feel, yeah, they're all for democracy. That's not a big issue. But in reality, there are very big questions around here. And I just, before this meeting, I looked at the CDU election platform, and one of its demands about rule of law is to find more formats of dialogue on rule of law in Europe. And you're just like, yeah, okay, that's, you know, if you don't want to do anything, you say we need 10 more fora of dialogue. I've been in so many dialogue fora, there's so much conversation about this that you feel, well, yeah, if you don't want to do anything, you talk about even more dialogue. So for me, it's a bit a failure of, I don't know, I don't want to blame the media always, but our whole political debate seems to be unpolitical, basically.
And Michael, your comments bring me into the heart of the next question I want to ask both of you, which is that Germany scored 5th out of 27 EU countries in the last World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. Why it's just behind the Netherlands and the Nordic countries, which have been leading on the rule of law within the EU. So my question, Michael, you've addressed it a bit, so I would direct this at two first, I think. Why hasn't Germany been leading more on this issue of the rule of law within EU with the challenges that we're seeing across some EU member states?
I must say I haven't actually looked at this index, so I am not entirely sure what they were looking at and why that is the case. I suppose the issues that Michael mentioned in the beginning play into it. At least I would assume it. Why is it not doing better in regard? I mean, well, how do I frame this properly? Of course, Germany is a big country. It's an influential country. It's a wealthy country, but it doesn't necessarily imply that it is a role model or the poster boy for everything on every area. But yeah, I'm not sure I can comment substantially on why it is not doing better than the Netherlands on this.
Thank you. But Michael, do you think it's more political reasons why Germany isn't leading when it comes to going against the backsliding we've seen on the rule of law in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that the politicians here and the diplomacy, there is a historical baggage. I think it's still there. So, you know, there is a big reluctance to be seen of being very assertive towards, especially to a country like Poland, where, you know, Germany has a terrible history towards Poland, and that is very strongly felt, I think, across the board here, except the AfD, who doesn't have any sentiment in that regard. But still, I don't know if it's the main explanation, because there's another field where Germany has been very assertive, and that was in the Euro crisis. And there we have been very assertive also with countries where we also had a strong historical baggage, like Greece. So it's maybe not I think it plays in, but it's maybe not the main explanation. And the hard explanation is the one that I think our colleague Daniel Hegedus put in Politico recently, saying it's at the end of the day, the entire German geostrategy is about economy. And of course, the integration of the EU towards the East has been fantastic for German business. Has been also good, of course, for Poland and Hungary. So it's a two-way road, but it has been extremely positive in terms of developing the markets and integrating supply chains and production lines and so forth. And in the case, especially strong was the marriage of the German car industry with Hungary, with the you know, approval or endorsement, or at least yeah, more than that probably, by CDU in particular. So I think we have a very, very strong element of hard economic policies that played in here. And if I look back at these 10 years, for me, it all went wrong. Of course, I have a very special perspective because I always work on democracy, but after Orban won the election in 2010 and started its changes, it was immediately clear that this was going completely wrong, and nobody really responded to that. And once you have a crack in the wall like this, you just see how it widens if you don't do something about it immediately. And to connect all this to things like Fridays for Future, in my view, it has all gone wrong. Then the German car industry, which has not been very innovative, has been totally overtaken now by Tesla because it didn't believe in batteries early enough, had all this political support, had cheap production in Hungary, where it had direct influence, could always call the prime minister if it didn't like something. And then Hungary supported Germany a lot in the EU to keep emission restrictions quite high to protect the German car industry. So I see how everything here, all this connection, in my view, lined up in the wrong way and made the German car industry now being quite uncompetitive and trying to catch up with companies like Tesla. So somehow it's all connected.
Yes, the economic aspect is one, and another one is looking at it. It seems that major groupings, political parties, have also been protecting backsliding on the rule of law. And I'm not blaming one single party. We've seen this across both major groups in the EPP and the Socialists and Democrats. Our political parties as kind of the main centers for the political participation in the representative democracy, have they not been failing on this issue when it comes to across Europe in how they address this and not keeping their sister parties, their national parties in line when it comes to this? Shouldn't there be more done there as well at the political level, internally within the political families, to push back on this backsliding?
Yeah, if you want me to talk more, I think that has been a failure for sure. It was most marked in the EPP with Hungary, where they accepted far too many provocations and should have acted much earlier. And for the Social Democrats, it was more in relation to Bulgaria. But and Poland is not part of those families, the PIS party, so that's a slightly different story. Of course, the reality in Brussels and Strasbourg in the European Parliament, it's very hard to cobble together these European groups. So a lot of compromises are being made, and you have a strong interest to build a big group in the European Parliament. So, I understand real politics, but if you ignore or never put up red lines, or EPP even put up red lines and then ignored its own red lines, at the end you pay the price. At the end, Fidesz left, or was half pushed out and half left by its own initiative, and that was so obvious to happen anyway. And I think the EPP would have had a much better standing now if they had processed along those lines much earlier toward something that was bound to happen anyway at some point.
Thank you. Now, going for what experts hate the most, journalists like the most, looking towards the future. We've got elections coming up on Sunday. It's going to be a real Rubik's Cube of colors and figuring out what the next coalition government would look like. I'd like both of you to maybe talk a bit about the options. How much change do you think we can expect from Germany's stance on the rule of law in Europe to change? Or would one coalition address this as more of an issue than we've seen in the past? Tu, I'll let you start with this exercise in projection.
Thank you. It is correct. I do hate projections, actually. But here someone already said in the comments or asked, the Greens pushing for a tougher course against Poland and Hungary's infringements. I think, at least in terms of what they say and what they want to do, I think they do have a tougher stance for now. So perhaps if there is really a government with the Greens and with SPD and without the CDU, we might see a difference in how Germany approaches, well, not just the rule of law, but also other policy areas. I think it also economic policies. I think will very much vary between different coalition options. So yeah, I actually think that, I don't think there will be fundamental differences, to be honest. It's not going to be a turnaround of 180 degrees, but I do think that on certain policy areas and in on certain issues, there will be a difference in both sometimes the direction that policy areas can go, and sometimes perhaps simply the strength and how much weight do we throw behind some areas. And I'm hoping that for the rule of law, it will particularly be how much weight do we throw behind it, how much support, political support does the government give to the European Commission, but also how much pressure does it sort of put on other governments horizontally. So I at least hope there will be a bit of a difference if there comes a change in government.
It's a question, of course, of arithmetics again, of coalitions. I think my assumption, and I'm just talking as an informed citizen, I'm not a pollster or anything, but my assumption is that it's quite unlikely the CDU will remain in government because the combinations that would allow it are quite unpopular with many of the parties that should be involved in any coalition with the CDU. So clearly in the SPD, nobody wants to continue a grand coalition. In the Green Party, I think there would be massive resistance to enter in a coalition with the CDU. So it's not so likely they will stay in government from what we know now. And if that's not the case, it boils more or less down to the so-called leftist coalition of left, Green, and SPD, or of something that is a bit more centrist with the liberal FDP, SPD, and the Greens. So it's more left or a bit center left, I would say. In both constellations, it's likely that the Green Party will take over the foreign ministry because it's a clear interest of theirs, while the Liberal Party is very interested in the finance ministry, and the Left Party would be too small to claim the foreign ministry. So I think we have a rather high likelihood that the Green Party will enter the foreign ministry. And I would say, knowing the undergirth of the Green parties, its MPs, its MEPs, the Böll-Stiftung, etc., they have strong opinions and a lot of analytical capacity on the questions we discuss here, and especially on rule of law in the EU. They have been very vocal. The big question is, foreign office is not that strong often in EU policies, which are, half internal, half external, and is more run from the chancellery. And there, in this constellation, you would have Olaf Scholz, who is quite a different figure. He has not been famous, for being very assertive on rule of law questions abroad. And that's a big question how this would play out. The big difference, of course, is that SPD has never been close to Fidesz and is not very close to PIS. So in that sense, there wouldn't be many party considerations, I think, on the SPD side. We are in a different world now, of course, because we have the rule of law mechanism. So I think most of us believe that these problems will only change if the hard policies come in, like EU funding to member states. And so the question is more or less if the new government would be supportive to the Commission applying these conditionalities. There was an interesting moment in the debate between the three lead candidates. The one I mentioned on foreign policy, which I think not many people watched, where the Green candidate Baerbock said that the Commission should instantly apply the rule of law conditionality. And then I think Laschet said something, yeah, but there's a court case. And she said, but that's not a reason not to apply it. You can apply it. And then they pretended that she doesn't know what she's talking about, but actually I think she had the correct command of the facts. I don't know if the other two tried to didn't want to talk about it or whatever, but it shows that, their lead candidate knows what the game is and has spoken about it. So we can expect strong support, I think, from a Green foreign ministry in this case.
Thank you both. We're answering some of the questions from the audience as we go along, moving from projections to what can and should be done. The first question would be, what role is there for civil society in Germany to try to push this as an issue on the German government and on the German political parties? Is there an interest in German civil society in the rule of law issues? And what could they do to actually try to put more pressure on the government, on the political parties to address this and really tackle this issue across the EU?
Tu, do you want to start, or?
Yeah. What can civil society do to push it more on the agenda? I think perhaps one important thing would be to really explain also to the public why should we care about what happens in Poland and Hungary? Because I feel like sometimes it seems like it's a problem for Poland, it's a problem for Hungary. Okay, something is going wrong there. It's something wrong with their judiciary and their judges, but how does it even affect us so much in Germany? I think often, or sometimes it seems like it's being seen as not really our problem so much, or perhaps a problem there, and then it's often tied to money. Do we want our money to go to I don't know, a country where judges are not independent? I think it's just also a matter of really education, explanation as to why do rule of law issues in other member states or in the EU in general affect the EU and affect Germany. So I think it's also really a lot of explanation and really education that can perhaps be done. And of course, if the issues is raised more on the ground and in the public, perhaps it will put more pressure on the government. But I think it's really this effect, or the explanation of the effects of things happening in other member states are not just a problem of that member state. So that in the EU, it has an effect on everything, and on other member states and on us as well.
Yeah, in my perception, it's again a bit a slightly strange situation that I have the feeling that I don't have now scientific data to prove it, that many people in Germany know that there are serious problems, especially the Hungarian case, I think is quite well known, and the Polish more and more also, and the Polish, I mean, the government is so brutish that it's, you know, quite easy to explain. It's not very subtle legal maneuvers. It's really, yeah, it's in your face, and that, you know, people understand that better than, you know, the complex legal maneuvers that the Fidesz has been doing for many years. But there's this fundamental understanding, and people don't like it, but to lift it to the policy level. So what can we do about it, and what's the situation? And I found it extremely interesting when Germany had the EU presidency last year and the rule of law mechanism was discussed and negotiated. And you remember there was a real standoff. Would this happen? Would Germany stand firm? And even many journalists who had written a lot about Hungary and Poland suddenly didn't say much about it. And I felt like, well, we are the presidency. It's in a way in our hand now to do something, and suddenly there is no public debate. So you wrote 20 articles about how bad is Hungary, but then when the German government is there to do something about it, there's no debate about it and no big pressure. So in my view is still this challenge to work with civil society and actors to create a connection to politics, that people understand this is not just happening in Hungary. It has a lot to do with what people here are doing in our ministries and in the chancellery and so forth, and challenge them on that. And that, I think, that's a way that I would go. And of course, in this project, we're already working in that direction to engage more with journalists and make it more simple, but connect a bit this public sentiment to policy making. And in a way, it's, you know, that people become more realistic about these things. How do they work? Where do you make the change? This is, I think, what we should be working on. I should add, Hans, I saw someone who said, works a lot with Belarus, and she wrote, when I tell Belarusians that in the German election campaign, nobody talks about their country, they really can't believe it. So I just want to put this here as well. We have, of course, Hungary and Poland, but we also have a situation that is uncomparable and absolutely horrible. And it's not far from here, and nobody talks about it. So, and again, it's something where we can do things, you know, we can have sanctions of different degrees. We could discuss it. We could discuss what should the EU do about it. Should the EU try to talk more to Russia about it? Whatever your position may be, but it hasn't been a subject of debate.
Thank you. You're once again bringing me towards the closing question for today. I'd like to let the audience know that if you look in the chat, you'll see that we have a little survey there that we'd ask you to please fill out to let us know how we did today, how we can adapt it to make it better. But let's say that I managed to force the future government, the future chancellor, to sit down with us. What would your advice be, each of you, to them, for what Germany should do next when it comes to the rule of law within the country and within Europe? Let's say the 2 or 3 issues that you think Germany should take a stab at. It should be a priority on addressing the rule of law, both within the country and in the EU. 2, I'll let you go first.
I think for the within Germany part, it's really strengthening the role of the ECJ or the position of the ECJ within Germany, and really reiterating the primacy of EU law in Germany, and really making clear to the Commission, to Brussels, to Luxembourg, but also the other member states that that there really isn't so much doubt about the supremacy of EU law. And within the EU, or for rule of law in the EU, I think what we really need is a clear political support to the Commission to enforce the rule of law, because we know that a lot of procedures and a lot of actions that can be done on EU level are done by the Commission, and the Commission perhaps doesn't always want to act so much if it's not sure of the political support of the member states, because of course often or even under the rule of law mechanism, it will need the council to vote with qualified majority, but also, I mean, it ties into the institutional framework. The Commission needs the member states to get on with legislative projects. It needs the member states to do all sort of things that want to do. So I think, especially with a large country as Germany and an influential one as Germany, what really should be done is reaffirming and really giving the political support to the Commission to take action, and really to say, listen, we stand behind you. Go ahead with the mechanism, go ahead with the infringement proceedings, go ahead with withholding the recovery funds. We support it, and where it's necessary, we'll also, in fact, organize the political support for you. Because for a lot of things, you'll need the member states to back it. And then I think as the German government or as Germany, you can do both. Show the political support, but also perhaps organize the political support where it is necessary to enforce the rule of law. Because I mean, Germany by itself can't really do so much actually on EU level. So I think it's really this political commitment to it that is important.
Yeah, I think that was very powerful, and I would, yeah, I fully agree to that. And I think I would advise the new chancellor to say, take a clear public position, and it doesn't need to be super hardline, but to signal that it's a key strategic priority for Germany to keep the EU together as a union of democratic rule of law-based state. And to say we don't believe the union works if we are not sure that all member states are rule of law-based democracies. It's a sine qua non for us. And be specific about what that means, and also explain that to the German population, why that is a clear priority. I think that's often because German rhetoric is often so much in the clouds that, you know, we need clearer statements of where are the red lines, and then also saying, but of course we are in the EU with 26 other member states, so we will not always get exactly what we want. That's the nature of the game, but this is how we see it, and that is our starting point. So this is what I would expect from a new chancellor, to be absolutely clear about that. Also to keep the connection, you know, we cannot talk about rule of law all the time, and maybe suddenly tomorrow in Hungary, the problem may look like democracy again. An opposition party wins and wants to implement new policies in Hungary, and then it has all these cardinal laws and this constitution and can't move. Then we would say it's a democracy problem because they have a majority but can't do anything. So the three things, democracy, human rights, rule of law, have to be kept together. They are part and parcel. We cannot pick one out and then discover tomorrow, oh, now it's another one. And inside Germany, I think really not resting, because we are on high positions in some charts, but there is still a big need, I think, to do things differently here. And I think a lot has to do with transparency and anti-corruption things. The Commission report also signaled that there are some concerns that consultative procedures become a bit slow, a bit short here in Parliament. And also that there is, of course, a concern what happens before official consultations. And there is really often here the fear that certain laws are written by lobbyists and then just handed into ministries. And that's, I think we should really get inspiration and try to be more Scandinavian than we are at the moment, and it will be to everybody's benefit. So this would be my wish for the next government.
Thank you. Well, hopefully the parties are hearing your wishes. I would like to thank both of you too, and Michael, for taking the time to go into these issues with me. This morning, I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today. We hope that we shone a light on the rule of law, on the situation in Germany, on some pathways for solutions. So with that, I will thank all of you for your attendance today. Wish you a great weekend, and remind everyone that if you can, remember to vote for Sunday while we watch the results come in. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Hans.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.